Hi, this is Paul. We've been working on the language of creation and just to the end of the section on heaven and earth, chapter 13, wisdom and understanding. And I sort of kept this one separate because it's an interesting point. You make some interesting points in this chapter. Example, wisdom and understanding. With wisdom, the Lord founded the earth. With understanding, he established the heavens. In the Bible, the union of heaven and earth is often defined in terms of wisdom and understanding. That's an interesting point and one that I'd never thought of. There are divine principles by which God founded the earth and established the heavens. Part of the weird thing about being a Christian minister is that you read this stuff all the time and you glaze over things, you glide over things, and you don't ever pause to think about them. And so when you read a book like this, you have to pause to think about them. The beginning of wisdom is get wisdom, and with all you have gotten, get understanding. Okay, what is wisdom and what is understanding? First point of creation, wisdom. According to the cosmology, wisdom is the first... I have to watch it. Okay. According to the cosmology, wisdom is the first principle of creation. Therefore, it is often envisioned as a concentrated point, a cosmic seed that contains the whole universe as pure information. The seed was a very important symbol in the ancient cosmology. It was the closest tangible example of purely spiritual or heavenly principle. Now, that gets into questions of reproduction because sperm, seed, often it was thought that sperm were tiny little human beings and they're implanted. So you have this virgin soil. And if you think about Jonathan Peugeot talking to Jordan Peterson about virginity, what virginity is, I'd always heard the perpetual virginity of Mary, but until I heard Peugeot talk about it, I never had any idea what they were talking about. It just sounded ludicrous, partly because I've been deeply steeped in materialism. Well, if you sort of change the meaning of the language, well, I can sort of understand what you're talking about. Of course, the ancients did not consider the seed to contain a coded language like DNA, which detailed instructions to build a living organism. Rather, it was seen as a foundational principle that only expressed minimal information. Like an axiom in mathematics, the seed is a self-evident principle that implicitly contains everything in a point-like form. God made the earth by powers, he formed the world by wisdom, and he stretched out the heavens by understanding. This is a very imaginative chapter. I find it, I don't always know what to do with it, but I find it stretches me and it's sort of seed-like in my brain. Given its seed-like properties, it is usually difficult to appreciate wisdom. Now, wisdom, chokmah, it's a very interesting word in the Old Testament, and well, maybe I should pull up my Bible software. All right, let's take a look at, let's say, what conventional historical grammatical studies say about this word. We can pull up ISB. That's often a good place to start. Wisdom in the Bible. In the Bible, the most common technical terms for wisdom are Hebrew chokmah in the Old Testament and Greek sophia in the New Testament. Alongside these expressions exist a wide variety of other words and phrases that express the same or related ideas. Because the understanding of these terms changes over time and different in various sociocultural settings, the semantic field of these terms is not historically constant. For that reason, synonyms and related wisdom vocabulary vary throughout the biblical traditions. A full appreciation of the significance of wisdom in the Bible depends on the recognition of this historical complexity. At the same time, comprehension of biblical wisdom must not lose its peculiar focus on wisdom as an essential idiom and a particular literary manifestation within the composition of Jewish and Christian thought. Wisdom in the ancient Near East. Ancient Israelites often borrowed forms of wisdom from non-Israelite sources, through oral and literary interactions with Edom, Egypt, Mesopotamia, and other nations. At present, the only extensive extra-biblical examples of wisdom literature text are from Egypt and Mesopotamia. Tablets from Ebla may change this picture, but they are not yet available for our consideration. Isby's a few years old, so it might be. With large fertile river valleys and prime geographic locations, Egypt and Mesopotamia had numerous economic advantages over Israel. In prosperous times, they exercised tremendous political influence, and their cultural standards undoubtedly spread throughout the lesser nations of the Near East. International reputations for wisdom expertise would be attained both by individuals, see Solomon below, and whole nations, suggesting that despite many variations in what each culture might value as particular manifestations of wisdom, some degree of consensus existed among the nations. At a minimum, this internationally recognized wisdom would have comprised technical skills, general knowledge of the world, and a great faculty in the use of proverbs and riddles. Let's look at Egyptian wisdom. Though we do not have from Egypt a corpus explicitly labeled wisdom literature, scholars have taken note of several types of school literature that conforms generally to the pragmatic utilitarian character of wisdom. Wisdom is not an esoteric thing often, it's a very practical thing, and I think that's part of what Peugeot is getting at here. The most prominent examples of this teaching are didactic texts that sustained popularity from 2300 to 100 BC, intended to provide training in Ma'at, order, justice, truth. These earliest texts of didactic prose and learning sayings, which in later periods contained an increasingly number of aphorisms, are usually presented in the form of advice from a prominent official to his son. This practice corresponded conveniently to the teacher-student relationship in Egyptian scribal schools. According to the school setting, became a surrogate for common education in the home. Some texts, such as the instruction of a man for his son, portray vividly the classroom setting of scribes who these teachings belong to. Similarly, between Egypt and biblical wisdom, the similarities between Egyptian and biblical wisdom became obvious in the modern period with the discovery of instructional text of a minor official. Amenemop, or Mope, probably belonging to the 18th dynasty. This text, or an oral counterpart, appears to have been the source of much of Proverbs 22:17 to 23:14. Incline your ear and listen to the words of the wise. Apply your heart to my knowledge, for it will be pleasant if you keep them within you, if all of them are ready on your lips. That your trust may be in the Lord. I have made them known to you today, even to you. I have not written for you 30 sayings of counsel and knowledge to make you know what is right and true, that you may give a true answer to those. Ancient Near East texts. Derived originally from the 13th to the 12th century BC, if not earlier, the style corresponds to the father-son pattern of instruction found in Proverbs. The close resonance of part of Proverbs with this Egyptian text confirms that Israel freely borrowed and adapted wise sayings from other nations in the composition of distinctly Israelite wisdom literature. Wisdom literature in ancient Israel. Essential characteristics and historical development. The most common term for wisdom in the Old Testament, chokmah, predominantly refers to an educated discipline or skillful performance in the world. This term occurs commonly throughout Old Testament traditions to denote almost any acquired skill or learned craft. It includes an ability to wage war, tailoring, cloth making, metalwork and carpentry, navigation at sea, and political administration. Chokmah may also concern one's level of intelligence. The absence of it explains why the ostrich lacks the common sense expected of other animals, Job 39. Conversely, certain prophets and magicians are led astray because of poor judgment. Wisdom is designated as an attribute of God, the acquisition of some famous persons, and distinct assets of some nations. A mundane practical wisdom within Israelite understanding may have been preceded in time a more articulate expression of its religious nature. Undoubtedly, some substantial changes in the religious interpretation of wisdom occurred within the history of Israel. Certainly in the exilic and post-exilic periods, a transformation took place in the relations of wisdom to Torah, and eventually in the perception of this relation to other biblical traditions. Occasionally, this way of seeking to derive biblical wisdom from scriptural tradition that was not wisdom, according to either genre, is designated as invited by late editorial editions. These historical modifications in the understanding of wisdom are difficult to recover solely from the book of Proverbs because of the lack of any historical references and accentuate their gnomic universal nature. I've read this passage before. It's from Neil Postman's "Amusing Ourselves to Death." It makes some very interesting points with respect to Proverbs and community. He was first reading Northrop Frye, and apart from Frye, who I am certain would raise no objection to take his word from me, every medium of communication I am claiming has resonance, for resonance is metaphor writ large. Whatever the original or limited context of use may have been, medium was the power to fly far beyond the context into new and unexpected ones. Because of the way it directs us to organize our minds and integrate our experience of the world, it imposes itself on our consciousness and social institutions in myriad form. It sometimes has the power to become implicated in our concepts of piety, of goodness, or of beauty. In other words, I think Postman again is sort of talking about this heaven meeting earth here. It's word meeting context. To explain how this happens, how the bias of a medium sits heavy, felt but unseen, over a culture, I offer three cases of truth-telling. First is drawn from a tribe in Western Africa that has no writing system, but whose rich oral tradition was given form in its idea of civil law. When a dispute arises, the complainants come before the chief of the tribe and state their grievances. With no written law to guide him, the task of the chief is to search through his vast repertoire of proverbs and sayings to find one that suits the situation and is equally satisfying to both complainants. That accomplished, all parties are agreed that justice has been done, that the truth has been served. You will recognize, of course, that this is largely the method of Jesus and other biblical figures who, living in an essentially oral culture, some of this is debatable, Postman is not a biblical scholar, drew upon all the resources of speech, including mimetic devices, formulaic expressions, and proverbs, as a means of discovery and revealing truth. As Walter Ong points out, in oral traditions, proverbs and sayings are not occasional devices. They are incessant. They form the substance of thought itself. Thought in any extended form is impossible without them. They consist in it. To people like ourselves, any reliance on proverbs and sayings is reserved largely for resolving disputes among or with children. Possession is 9/10 of the law. First come, first serve. Haste makes waste. These are forms of speech we pull out in small crises with our young, but would think ridiculous to produce in a courtroom where serious matters are decided. Can you imagine a bailiff asking a jury, if it has reached a decision, and receiving the reply, "To err is human, but to forgive divine"? Or even better, let us render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God's. For the briefest moment, the judge might be charmed, but if a serious language form is not immediately forthcoming, the jury may end up with a longer sentence than most guilty defendants. I read that to give a sense of wisdom and some of what I think Peugeot is seeing in the text here. There aren't a lot of footnotes in this book, and so this isn't a book done by a biblical scholar. Now that has upsides and downsides, which I'm sure many of you will note in the comments section. But there is again, I want to focus on the nature, the connection of wisdom to, let's say in Petersonian terms, a world of action. And wisdom, as Postman notes, sort of settles things. It's a way that, let's say, two sides are combating. The judge pulls out a proverb, both sides are satisfied. There's actually there an authority structure that both sides agree with. And I would say that any mutual resolution of a conflict depends upon a joint authority structure. Okay, let's keep reading in the book. Given its seed-like properties, it is usually difficult to appreciate wisdom because it is far too simple and contains too much information. Therefore, the role of understanding is to stretch out the heavens, which means developing, explaining, and detailing the ramifications of the seed. And he has a little diagram here of a little ball on top, that's wisdom, and then arrows down to stretching out the heavens. In this context, the role of understanding is perfectly analogous to that of Earth's soil. It is the power that expands and expresses a seed into something knowable. With wisdom, the Lord founded the earth. With understanding, he established the heavens. With his knowledge, the depths were split, and the skies dropped the dew. As shown in the following diagram, understanding is the power that supports a principle with specific facts. And I just can't read this without thinking about Vervaeke talking about understanding, what that word means. And it gets into seemingly the natural. As shown in the following diagram, understanding is the power that supports a principle with specific facts, and wisdom is the principle that covers these facts with a spiritual identity. Boy, those are words you hear Jonathan Pageau use a lot. Knowledge is the process and the final result of these interactions. So you've got wisdom, understanding, and then knowledge. With wisdom, a house is built. With understanding, it is established. With knowledge, its rooms are filled. With wisdom, a house is built. With understanding, it is established. So built is sort of the initiator. And you get the sense here that house is not just, this is one of these pre-Barfieldian splits. House is not just building. It's probably house and home together initially before this sort of Barfieldian split. With wisdom, a house is built. With understanding, it is established. And with knowledge, its rooms are filled. I have to keep avoiding. Okay. This basic structure is referred to as the cosmic tree. It is considered the principle of space in ancient cosmology. The symbolism of spatial axis will be fully described in section 4 of this commentary. In Hebrew, the word understanding is connected both to the concept of building and in between. Well, let's look at understanding. 89 of the 113 Revised Standard Version Old Testament occurrences of the word translated the Hebrew bin, or one of its derivatives. This word group, from a root meaning to discern, refers to the sound application of knowledge. It is found predominantly in wisdom literature, and to a lesser extent in several of the major prophets. Job and his friends searched for understanding, to discern, so the discernment of knowledge. Job and his friends searched for understanding. Well, why did Job and his friends search for understanding? They searched for understanding because something had happened, Job's calamities, which was unexpected in their fairly karmic view of the way the world worked and so they searched for understanding. They're looking for application of what happened. The good, upright men of the Psalms and Proverbs possessed it, and the foolish, wicked lack it. Job 28:28. Behold, the fear of the Lord, that is wisdom, and to turn away from evil is understanding. Underlines the moral character of this understanding. To depart from evil is understanding. But this does not exclude a cognitive component. That's very interesting because, boy, I'm just remembering something I read about cognition and Hebrew culture and language. I wish I could pull that up completely. Such understanding comes only from studying God's precepts, Psalm 119. For it was by understanding that God fashioned all creation. This word group appears regularly in conjunction with words for wisdom and discretion. Hebrew sakal, or sakal, is a derivative of frequently interchangeable with bin, but at times put more emphasis on intellectual or rational skills. 3 times Aramaic sakletanu refers to the ability to interpret dreams. Hebrew lev or levav is most often heart. It usually refers to the innermost thoughts, feelings, and commitments of the individual. The RSV translates it understanding in contexts where that are rational more than emotional. You can see here on the picture the distribution of Hebrew words with respect to common translations. Understand the majority, understanding, see, pay attention, consider, teach, examine. The second, understanding, cleverness, and skill. Here's a list of some elements of it. It comes up often in Job. Teach me and I will be silent. Make me understand how I have gone astray. What do you know that we do not know? What do you understand that is not clear to us? It is not the old who are wise, nor the aged who understand what is right. Can anyone understand the spreading of clouds, the thundering of his pavilion? A lot of uses in the Psalms and the Proverbs, quite obviously. The ox knows its owner, the donkey its master's crib, but Israel does not know, my people do not understand. And, part of Hebrew poetry is these couplets which are showing a relationship, and it's really helpful for getting the sense of words. How often as it passed through it will take you, for morning by morning it will pass through, day by day, night by night, and it will be sheer terror to understand the message. The heart of the hasty will understand and know. The tongue of the stammerers will hasten to speak distinctly. Very common word, a lot in Daniel. Here he's got this nice little chart. So wisdom is on top, understanding is below, and wisdom and understanding make knowledge. Another important way to describe these fundamental interactions with the imagery of building a house, in this case, wisdom is analogous to the plan of the house, and understanding is the process that puts the plan into practice. From one end, a spiritual principle must be lowered into concrete reality. Use of spiritual there, I think, is really vital and helpful. From the other end, building materials must be raised into meaningful and coherent structure. Another important aspect to this imagery is the notion that buildings are microcosms of creation. In this case, the roof and the base of the house are analogous to the heavens and the earth, respectively. Also, the symbolism of pillars is especially important in this context. They represent the supports of a spiritual principle and are usually called pillars of the earth at a cosmic scale. And there he's got a footnote. These pillars are usually depicted as opposites, like the pillars of Joachim and Boaz, in order to express the maximum range of implications. By definition, opposites are the most different expressions possible, which means they always provide the best support for knowledge. This is one of the reasons why opposites are so often commonplace in ancient symbolism. I think I forgot to turn on the recording for some of this, so I'll just fill it in now. Again, looking at Craig Bloomberg's article in ISBE on understanding, the word group, from a root meaning to discern, refers to the sound application of knowledge. So in other words, Bloomberg's sort of going the other way. So you have wisdom, knowledge, and understanding. You gain understanding with hands-on things, and that sort of becomes knowledge, which is in the middle, which can sort of be reproduced. And see, wisdom is the seed, goes down to understanding, then comes up into knowledge. And knowledge is sort of this middle thing. Job and his friends search for understanding. That's key, of course, because what happens with Job's calamity is it breaks the assumed karmic structure of the world, and Job's friends continue to try to apply karma to Job's situation, but Job says basically the karma doesn't work in this situation because I've done nothing wrong. That's at the heart of the book of Job. So maybe I'll leave this video here so it can just be, I'll save chapter 14 for the next video. But I did think that chapter 13 was important in and of itself because I found his articulation helpful in gaining understanding, let's say. Okay, on to chapter 14. Humanity in the image of God. This is a huge topic. In fact, I just recorded about 45 minutes of a video that I scrapped. I don't do that often, but I made the video about Brett Weinstein and his, there's an element in which Brett is Gnostic in terms of this assumption that if the world is created by evolution, the God of evolution is an immoral God. But Brett is not Gnostic in the sense that he anticipates an immaterial world. And the question of Gnosticism came up in the Peterson-Peugeot conversation, and I thought Jonathan handled that very well, because Christianity basically says that the world is good. And when Jordan asserts that his skepticism with respect to something like the physicality of the resurrection of Jesus, Jonathan leans in and basically says part of the point of its goodness is that the world is capable of physically manifesting the goodness of God. Humanity we are strange creatures. And part of what I leaned into in that video about Weinstein. Now, a lot of people, I get more comments than usual when I do videos on the Weinsteins about why are you talking about them? I talk about them because usually the people that I pick on out there in the public space, I talk about them because they illustrate a lot of the ideas that I'm wrestling with. The idea that we are we behave very strangely for materialists, because, as Maps of Meaning pretty much wrote about, we'll kill each other over immaterial things. Because what we're generally dealing with are mappings of the world, most of which mappings are immaterial. They might be intersubjective, but most of what we're fighting about are the mappings, because we know that the mappings will at some point manifest themselves in materiality. And so it's in that way that our battles are indeed spiritual, in the sense that Peugeot uses when he used that word spiritual. From one end, a spiritual principle must be lowered into concrete reality. And I think, let's see if I can highlight it. Yeah, there we go. I think that is exactly the right sense of the word spiritual. And human beings are therefore different from the animals. No animal that we know of maps spiritual like we do. They are, in that sense, purely physical. We are not. And part, I think, of Peterson's real contribution is, especially when he starts talking about sacrifice and mapping the future, he's pointing to just how spiritual we are. And again, I'm not necessarily, I don't like the natural supernatural distinction, although I understand it. I'm not talking necessarily about anything supernatural when I use that word spiritual. And part of the problem is that romantics understand spiritual to be emotional. No, emotionality is the way in which we're dealing with the spiritual, but the spiritual is between us. And it's in this sense that we are spiritual. And it's in this sense that we are these in-between creatures between heaven and earth. So chapter 14, humanity in the image of God. God created the human in his image. In the image of God, he created him. As will be discovered in this section, the narrative of creation also provides significant insight about the role of humanity in the universe. Most importantly, according to biblical cosmology, the function of human beings is to act as a mediator between heaven and earth for the knowledge of God within the creation. Okay, and that's why I read the last chapter, because knowledge is sort of this middle thing. Wisdom comes down into understanding. Understanding goes up into knowledge. And it's in that sense, if you've got Plato pointing up and Aristotle pointing down, it's kind of down and then up. Okay? Most importantly, according to the biblical cosmology, the function of human beings is to act as a mediator between heaven and earth for the knowledge of God within creation. And he's got here 3 circles: creator, heaven and earth, and then heaven and earth and Adam in between. In this context, the notion that Adam is in the image of God means that humanity is a symbol of the creator within the creation. I think that's exactly right. And if maybe I'll have to try and remake that video I just erased, because if you listen to Brett Weinstein and his Gnosticism, and his half Gnosticism, let's say, he is in fact attempting to manifest exactly what Peugeot is saying here. Because listen to Eric, we have to get off this rock. That is an image of God move that he is making. Because he's mapping, he's bringing spirituality into the spiritual joint mappings that we are working on together. And it's in fact over the mappings that we fight. The entire Cold War was a war of mapping. And Peterson's point in this book is exactly that. Adam is the embodiment of divine knowledge in the world. Unlike regular knowledge, which involves the union of spirit and matter for created things, this type of knowledge transcends itself into a form of metacognition. The following diagram represents the ultimate pattern of interpretation in the Bible. Although it is similar to patterns discussed in the previous section, this structure involves an indefinitely higher level. The knowledge of God in creation, this overarching symbolism, and Adam's general role as mediator between heaven and earth will be discussed in detail throughout this section. So we've got meta-knowledge on top, God down into Adam, but earth and heaven also into Adam. Chapter 15. God formed the humans from the dust of the ground, earth, and breathed into his nostril the breath of life, heaven. In the story of the Garden of Eden, humanity is described as a microcosm of creation. Thus, Adam is created by joining a body from the earth and a breath from heaven. As illustrated above, the soul and body of Adam may simply be interpreted as instances of heaven and earth at the level of human experience. Accordingly, the word spirit simultaneously refers to the wind of heaven and the breath of living creatures. These are one and the same biblical cosmology, okay? So this is before the Barfieldian split that I keep talking about with respect to Lewis. And again, the problem we have is you can't go back through those forks into the unity. You have to sort of, in a Barfieldian way, you have initial participation, this divorce from participation, and then final participation. But the final participation is not the same as the initial participation. And so right now we're sort of in that middle phase. The primary role of Adam in this context is to act as mediator between heaven and earth for the union of spirit and matter in creation. Moreover, this union defines Adam completely, not just at the moment of creation, but throughout his entire life. In other words, not only was Adam made by joining dust and breath, but this is also the impetus of everything he does. At a basic level, human life consists of breathing and nutrition. The first is when heaven's air is translated into Adam's breath, and the second is when the earth's soil is translated into Adam's flesh. In this manner, the cosmic union of heaven and earth is reflected at human levels. Thus, by simply staying alive, Adam is contributing to the greater goal of creation. Conversely, if Adam dies, a part of corporeal reality loses its higher spiritual purpose, and a part of spiritual reality loses lower corporeal expression. So, inform, authority from above, symbolize knowledge, express in terms of power. And the heart is in the middle. Head, body, heart. Interesting. For humans, it is also important to remember that breathing involves the ability to speak, which makes it a vehicle of language and information. Thus, in the human microcosm, Adam's head represents the first principle, wisdom, as the source of meaning for the body. The Hebrew word head implies first principle, does in Greek too, a meaning that also implied in the English words as head, captain, chief, etc. The role of head is to provide a unifying principle to answer the dark, subconscious enigma of the flesh. In exchange, the body expresses and supports the head with actions of arms and legs. On the whole, Adam's existence is centered on knowledge, which refers to the union of heaven spirit and earth body. Therefore, humanity's impetus in the universe can adequately be summed up as informing matter with meaning and expressing meaning with matter. This extremely simple formula surprisingly encompasses all human activity, including reproduction, technology, government, and science. They are all instances of joining matter with meaning. This reminds me quite a bit of how C.S. Lewis deals with reason in his book Miracles. And so in this section, he's talking about naturalism as the whole show. And then he says, well, dualism is something that people look at, like God and nature are two separate things, as it were. And then he dismisses that. And then he goes into a little bit of this union that I see Peugeot talking about. The relations which arise at the frontier are indeed of a most complicated and intimate sort. That spearhead of the supernatural, which I call my reason, links up with all my natural contents, my sensations, emotions, and the like, so completely that I call the mixture, by a single word, me. Again, there is what I have called the unsymmetrical character of the frontier relations. When the physical state of the brain dominates my thinking, it produces only disorder. And this is why I didn't make that video. I erased that video. This is why the opposite of theism is not atheism or non-theism. It is mere animality. If that there is a sense in which, a hierarchy of values develops, a sense in which directedness, which happens in consciousness, develops, that there's a sense of that happening that is separate from the animals we see around us, let's say. Again, there's what I call the unsymmetrical character of frontier relations. When the physical state of the brain dominates my thinking, it produces only disorder. But my brain does not become any less a brain when it is dominated by reason, nor do my emotions and sensations become any less emotions and sensations. Reason, capital R, saves and strengthens my whole system, psychological and physical, whereas that whole system, by rebelling against reason, destroys both reason and itself. The military metaphor of a spearhead was apparently ill-chosen. The supernatural reason enters my natural being not like a weapon, more like a beam of light, which illuminates, or a principle of organization which unifies and develops. And you can see that in Peugeot's sense here. Our whole picture of nature being invaded as by a foreign enemy was wrong. When we actually examine one of these invasions, it looks much more like the arrival of a king among his own subjects, or a mahout visiting his own elephant. The elephant may run amok. Nature may be rebellious, but from observing what happens when nature obeys, it is almost impossible not to conclude that it is her very nature to be a subject. All happens as if she had been designed for that very role. To believe that nature produces God, or even the human mind, is, as we have seen, absurd. To believe that the two are both independently self-existent is impossible. At least the attempt to do so leaves me unable to think that I am thinking of anything at all. It is true that dualism has certain theological attraction, but it seems to make the problem of evil easier. But if we cannot, in fact, think dualism out to the end, this attractive promise may never be kept, and I think there are better solutions to the problem of evil. There remains, then, the belief that God created nature. This at once supplies a relation between them and gets rid of the difficulties of the sheer otherness. It also fits into the observed frontier situation in which everything looks as if nature were not resisting an alien invader, but rebelling against a lawful sovereign. This, and perhaps this alone, fits in with the fact that nature, though not apparently intelligent, is intelligible. That events in the remotest parts of space appear to obey the laws of rational thought. Even the act of creation itself presents none of the intolerable difficulties which seem to meet us on every other hypothesis. There is in our own minds something that bears a faint resemblance to it. We can imagine, that is, we can cause to exist the mental pictures of material objects and even human characters and events. We fall short of creation in two ways. In the first place, we can only recombine elements borrowed from the real universe. No one can imagine a new primary color or a sixth sense. In the second place, we can imagine what we imagine exists only in our consciousness, though we can, by words, induce other people to build for themselves pictures in their own minds which can be roughly similar to it. We should have to attribute to God the power of both producing the basic element and of inventing not only colors, but color itself, the senses themselves, space, time, and matter themselves, and also of imposing what he has invented on created minds. This seems to be no intolerable assumption. It's certainly easier than the idea of God and nature as wholly unrelated entities, and far easier than the idea of nature producing valid thought. I don't know if Peugeot will go into it, but if you understand this, then the stories in Genesis of the cursing of the ground and the cursing of the womb make sense, because, well, basically, nature rebels against us just as we rebelled against God. So now, as the practice of the book is, he gives sort of the principles in earlier chapters and then goes into examples. And I found the examples often help to illustrate what he's talking about. Chapter 16, example, manna and flesh. God will give you flesh in the evening to eat and bread in the morning to the full. The example provided in this chapter is a particularly clear case of the interactions between heaven and earth. It unmistakably depicts the dual influences of heaven and earth in the form of manna and quails during Israel's exodus. It also provides some important examples of interactions between the macrocosm and microcosm, where the influences of heaven and earth are translated into human experiences. Lowering seed and raising flesh. Exodus 16 and Numbers 11. Children of Israel, wouldn't it have been better for us to die in Egypt as we sat by the flesh pots and ate bread to the full? Have you brought us to the wilderness to kill us with hunger? God, I will rain bread from heaven, and the people will gather it every day to test whether or not they will follow my law. They will eat flesh in the evening and will be filled with bread in the morning, and they shall know that I am the Lord their God. At evening the quails ascended and covered the camp. When the dew descended on the camp during the night, manna descended upon it. In the morning there was a fine bareness like frost on the surface of the earth. When the children of Israel saw it, they said to each other, What is it? And they called it manna. It was like coriander seed, white, and tasted like wafers in honey, and its appearance was like crystal. It's really interesting, the descriptions of that, because those descriptions, you get biblical moments when people can't quite figure things out, and the language, they're trying to relate it, and it very much sounds like eyewitness accounts. The people gathered it, and they ground it, and made cakes from it. In the previous passage, manna and quails are depicted as descending and ascending respectively, and they also referred to as seeds and flesh. These two types of food represent the influences of heaven and earth in this narrative. On one end, manna is not a typical food, but a spiritual nutrition. Its primary purpose is not to sustain the body, but to inform the soul, that they may know that I am the Lord. Manna is compared to seeds in this narrative because seeds represent spiritual principles in biblical cosmology. These points of wisdom are considered to be full of implicit light, concentrated information, which is why manna is described as bright, clear, and light, and why it is associated with the first light of the morning. These heavenly principles are high in meaning and low in corporeality. They are point-like materializations of divine language, as clearly stated below. God fed you with manna to teach you that man does not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of God. On the other end, the quail are called flesh or meat, which refers to regular food in the sense of matter to sustain the body. They are depicted as ascending in the evening because they are akin to material obscurity. In general, flesh represents the counterpart of seed in the process of knowledge. Its role, like the earth's soil, is to detail or flesh out the implicit meaning of the seed. It is a case of manifestations because it makes the implicit explicit. See chapter 10. Manna means what? What is similar to quiddity of Western philosophy. Like a seed, manna embodies the simple sense of phenomenon. You shall eat flesh in the evening, and be filled with bread in the morning, and you shall know that I am the Lord your God. On the whole, the structure of this narrative is straightforward. It describes the nation of Israel as existing between heaven and earth, to receive the knowledge of God from their union. It's really interesting because, of course, they're in the wilderness, and wilderness is the land equivalent to sea. You'll notice interesting correspondence between the names of sea monsters and wilderness monsters, and so this is really quite fascinating. In general, the process of knowledge should always be interpreted in terms of two opposite transactions. It always involves materialization of meaning from above in exchange for refinement of matter from below. These exchanges of spirit and flesh are the two sides of a single coin because invisible truth cannot be made manifest without material sustenance. As illustrated above, the descent of manna towards the earth is a process of materialization. This is clear in the Bible because manna is compared to hoarfrost, which is solidification of dew, which is itself a condensation of air. Moreover, the process of making bread from manna represents the materialization at the human level. Indeed, making dough from flour, a fine white substance, symbolizes condensation, and making bread from dough symbolizes solidification. On the other hand, the ascent of quails into the camp and the preparation of their flesh is a process of refinement, where meat must be cleaned, tenderized, and cooked until suitable for human consumption. As will be demonstrated in later chapters, making bread and preparing meats are extremely significant in the Bible. They are important symbols of lowering meaning and raising matter for the union of heaven and earth at the human level. That's fascinating. I guess I'll leave it right there for now. And it's again, it's a very interesting book. I hope just walking through, and maybe it's not as helpful for you as me sort of reading it and commenting it is. So, well, let me know in the comments what you think. I'm going to have a conversation next week with Vin Armani. I didn't know who the guy was, and one of you sent me this video, and there's a rather extended section in this video where he talks about Jordan Peterson, and I've now taken up a correspondence with him, and he actually sent me to a video that he had done a conversation with Peterson a while ago on his own podcast. And this was sort of before Peterson arose in prominence. Now, why do I bring this up now? Right after working on the language of creation. Where's my copy of the book? I just always want to grab a copy of the book. The language working on. It's dyslexic. I always have it. Can't put it in the right place. The language of creation. Maybe I can figure that out. Get that in my head. How many times, well, I mentioned Vin Armani because he was using some of the same language that Peugeot uses with respect to the Bible and creation, the way things lay themselves out. And when you start reading the language of creation, you have a better sense of what Jonathan Peugeot means. he means that once you get this sense of once you get this sense of the problem is I'm going to use all the same words Peugeot uses, and they didn't communicate that well to me. Phenomenologically, if you look at how Brett Weinstein is, if you look at how Brett Weinstein is talking about humanity, as I talked about in this last video, he can't. This is where Peugeot is right. None of them can actually pull off talking about human beings and acting the way human beings are imagined to be within their own worldview. We are always unnatural. We are always a little lower than the angels. We are always sort of above it all. This is what happens when I make videos and then delete them. I wind up making them again. How do people act out the image of God, even if they say there is no God? They do it in this continuous project of human improvement, stabilization, security, and progress. They do so rebelliously and, ironically, in some ways, obediently, even within their rebellion. So Brett Weinstein is Gnostic in the aspect that he imagines the evolutionary biology of the world maker is an immoral God. But he is not Gnostic because he, sort of like Peugeot is describing in his book, is using his metacognition, his imagining himself as ruler of the earth, as Lewis describes, in terms of how to continue what? Humanity. We've got to get off this rock. Okay, that's what Eric keeps saying. Brett and Eric desperately talk as if they are committed to save humanity, but humanity is not the same as, let's say, the population of ostriches or the population of dogs. Humanity is something that we ourselves sort of know, even though we are it, but don't really know. And to have individual human beings arguing that humanity must be saved, even as we imagine eugenics and the creation of the Borg. Let's dip into the Star Trek imaginary. We don't even know what we're talking about in terms of that which should be saved. Because let's say freezing us all, well, that wouldn't be humanity being saved, because when they talk about humanity being saved, they're including the art and the knowledge and the politics and all of what we treasure and aspire, even though all of that has such a short shelf life. Again, I had a good conversation with Rafe Kelly, and he was noting, which was so right, so much of the current strife in terms of the culture war could greatly be helped if people would simply read history and understand that we really don't have much of a grasp of what we're talking about. Is humanity a real thing in their philosophical systems? It isn't strictly physical material. It is the colonization of the world by us. And so much of us is in between. We are the stuff of earth and the breath of God. And as Lewis said, we marshal all of these things in order to somehow maintain ourselves. Humanity is deeply committed to a variety of immaterial visions, and it is just shocking to watch celebrity atheists double down on materiality in the most immaterial way. Some of the most ardent physicalists among us are implicitly, inescapably committed to this tension and trapped by their project. They construct a vision of a better world and preach like religious zealots. I'm working on the pearly gates story in Lazarus and the rich man. And Kenneth Bailey, who I'm reading as I go through these, talks about all these pearly gate stories that you find in Middle Eastern culture with Moses and Jesus and Muhammad. They're in Jewish and Christian and Islamic traditions. And the point of these stories is not to map out the afterlife in the way that each of us would like to have a house mapped out like a floor plan. The point is to demonstrate the relationality between aspects and to use the afterlife to make points about what ought to happen now. And again, this is so much the Pageauian lays itself out idea. And you see this in Peterson talking to Pageau and the aiming for better. Well, what exactly is this better? I mean, the animals do it to a degree, but not like us. We have transformed the world, and we imagine it needs to be transformed to even greater degrees. And all of this transformation is happening in our imaginations. You know, we naturally want it to be better for us and for versions of us that are in some senses our neighbors and our loved ones. And then Jesus commands that we include our enemies in that list for betterment as well. And Peterson's talk about sacrifices and inventions of the future, you know, that's why naturalists get nervous, because it's in many ways very much spiritual thinking. And you can't help but think this way unless you have headroom above materiality. And again, we do this so naturally and easily. You know, the opposite of theism is mere animalism. It's not these the funny things about atheists are that they can become so esoteric. All of our fights are about mappings in this world, and atheists fight about mappings just as much as everyone else. And the whole point of maps of meaning is that we kill each other over imaginary maps more than in some ways we do over material goods. You know, we're not even tremendously conscious we're doing this. You know, call someone what they don't want to be called, even if it's a ridiculous thing, and you will have a fight on your hands. Why? We that much live. We're that much spiritual creatures. And so really all of this is a search for the image of God. How are we and aren't we like or unlike the animals? Are we or aren't we part of nature? What constitutes this humanity that must be preserved? Are we the stuff of earth and the breath of heaven? What is the breath of heaven? And again, we might say, well, we can track all the biology of our bodies. Okay, but where from? And we're right there in the middle of the Vervaeke-Pageauian split of emanation and emergence. If you think God is imaginary, go ahead and try to divorce yourself from this breath of God. He just keeps coming up. And again, as I said to Rafe Kelly, I said, you know, when he talked about, I can't believe in a God. Well, I think part of what happened in modernity is so that the church could sort of bring God through into our imagination, our one-eyed imagination of the world being a place of objects. We turned God into a thing. And it doesn't fit. And so this is where you get the bifurcation of God number one and God number two. And so when Peterson sort of brings God number two in, for Sam Harris, the presence or Peterson brings God number one in, Sam Harris looks at that and says, that's not God. This thing over here is God. So I think I'll just have to put this onto this last language of creation video that I just rendered, and maybe I'll just put them all together and release them all together for tomorrow. But it seems terribly rambly and disconnected, but I hope that there's some help in it for you.